So the intent of our session this afternoon is to think and preface about the idea around cultural responsiveness and to share some specific math ideas and examples. So we're hoping that everyone will think about moving towards math practices that are more culturally responsive for the students that are in your classroom. And we're very aware that this session may or may not be your first segue into the journey of learning about this topic, but we also know that the topic cannot be fully addressed or realized with only one 1 hour session. So hopefully this won't be the end of your learning on this topic too. So could you go to the next? There we go. Thanks, Chuck. So my name is Kirsten DeRoche. I'm an educational consultant at the Patent East office, and I'm joined by my colleague, Charles Moeller. Okay, there you go. So before we start, we just want to remind you that if you're using the SCED app, announcements for this conference are under the Info tab. So all announcements for today are also on the conference website, as well as our presenter bios. This session is being recorded and will run from 1:45 until 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you're interested in closed captioning, you should have a little button on the bottom on your, oops, thank you, on your Zoom taskbar that has closed captioning or the double C icon. Please click that if you are looking for closed captioning. You're up, Chuck.
Yep, getting the link, sorry.
Oh, no.
So we appreciate you being here. We have some expectations up on the screen. To go along with those expectations, we want you to know that we will be housing our resources, any information, and all of the sources that we got our information from on a corresponding Padlet. I did put that link in the chat. Sorry for the delay there. But some of the expectations are to just be present, right? Similar to the keynote this morning, I think he called them weapons of mass distraction. Just try and be present with us, put those away for now. Participate when you can. We have a couple opportunities to participate. We will save questions for the end. So if you have any questions, write them down and make sure that you save those for once we're done the presentation. Be open-minded, accept and expect non-closure, right? Like Kirsten said, this isn't probably we're not going to cover everything that we can cover about culturally responsive teaching today. So there may be some non-closure there. So just, it's okay. Consider and challenge your own beliefs and your practices and ask questions for clarification. We're going to start today by completing an activity where we will have you consider a statement. And depending on whether or not that statement describes you, we're going to ask you to either turn your video on or off. Kirsten's going to go over that with you, but it's just a fun way to see who we have in our session as participants, and it allows you to find some parallels amongst each other as participants as well. So Kirsten?
Excellent, thank you. Okay, so we're going to start by all turning our cameras off. The camera on/off button should be located in the bottom of or on your Zoom taskbar, and it looks like this little icon that you can see on the slide. And I'm going to give you a statement, and if that statement applies to you and matches your thinking, you're going to turn your camera on kind of as a way to say, hey, that's just like me. Okay, so we're going to try a really quick test run first, Chuck. I didn't tell you that I was going to do this. So
okay.
Let me do a quick one. Okay, so all cameras should be off. Okay, excellent. So I work in the field of education. Anybody who this applies to, flip it on. Oh, I see lots, and I was anticipating a lot. Hi, everybody. It's nice to see you all. Yay. Okay. So that's good. We've got some of the right people here, Chuck. That's good stuff. Right. Okay, so good. Cameras off. And now we're going to go through some other examples. This is not the test run. Here's the ones that really count. Okay, click, Chuck. I teach in Pennsylvania. Okay, and those of you who answered in the affirmative for this, go ahead and enter into the chat where you teach, so that maybe we can start to make some connections between each other. You might notice somebody that's on here that you didn't think was here? Great, we're getting a whole bunch of folks or several folks coming in here. There we go. Excellent. All over. We have people all over. Yeah. Okay, great. Okay, cameras off. Okay, next one, click. I work with students who are older than 12 years old. Cameras on. And if you do work with kids who are older than 12, go ahead and let us know in the chat what age, grade, subject, content, whichever it is that you do, so that we can make some connections there too.
Secondary people.
Yeah, we got lots of secondary folks. Excellent. Okay. Okay, great. Cameras off. And last example here is, I have fun plans, whatever that may be for you, for the summer. And if so, let us know what those are, so that I can live vicariously through you all and your fabulous summer plans.
Well, we would get more for this one.
Well, maybe people are still thinking, or their plans are so extensive.
Sending my kids away to camp.
Well, that sounds really fun. Awesome. Travel. Excellent, excellent. Okay. Wonderful.
Oh, nice. Building houses in Tennessee.
Wow. Yeah, people doing all kinds of fun stuff. Great, great. Okay. I think we're good to go, Chuck.
All right. So before we jump into culturally responsive teaching, we wanted to talk a little bit about the need, right? Why would there be a need for culturally responsive teaching? And so I pulled this graphic from the Science of Math, thescienceofmath.org. And this data comes from NAEP, which is the National Assessment of Educational Progress. So you can see here, right, we're all math people. You can see the graphs, you can see the visual, you can see that students that are not meeting proficiency increase from grade 4 to grade 8 to grade 12. So the gaps are widening, and we all know that math is somewhat of a hierarchical, is a hierarchical subject. So therefore, when students develop these gaps, as we continue on, if we're not filling those gaps in, then they just continue to increase. But some of the things that are really important here is that this is only compounded by ethnicity, right? Socioeconomic status, students with disabilities, multi-language learners. So you can see on the white stats, right, on the right-hand side, as well as the orange ovals on the bottom there, that it's not just a problem that we're losing students and their proficiency as they age, but we have these large gaps in these subgroups of students. So we know the gaps are accelerating. So how do we create change to stop that achievement decline, right? How do we stop that slide for students? And so one way that we might do that is to focus on the culture of the students and of our schools. And hopefully in changing those two, or making changes to that kind of mindset in ourselves as teachers, we can start to bring about some change for these. Because I do think that as teachers, math teachers specifically, we're constantly trying, and I know you are because you're here at this conference, but we're constantly trying, to fill those gaps. And so what are some other ways? Well, maybe we need to focus on the culture. So that's where we're going to start. So one way that we're going to have you participate today is called WooClap. And Kirsten found this website, and I was like, this is pretty neat. And it's just a survey website, but it allows you to change the way the data that comes in looks. So there's a couple different ways you can do this. You can scan the QR code. You can go to wooclap.com and put in the event code, which is PFGNJC, or you can send a text at PFGNJC to 855-910-9662. Now, when you send that text, I found this out the hard way. I actually participated in one myself. You get no reply that you're then in the survey. So once you send it, whatever you send after that would be your response, and that will show up. I promise you.
Chuck, I also put the link directly to this WooClap in the chat.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we're going to focus on culture, and we're going to look deeper into ourselves and maybe think about how we can change that to affect, right, the achievement gap, the other things that may be going on with our students, we first need to understand what culture is. So the question we're having you answer in this WooClap is, what is culture? How do you define culture? So I'll give you a minute to do that, and we'll take a look at some of the responses. The responses will come in, they'll be anonymous, they're not going to have your name on them. So what is culture to you? You can see as they come in, they're populating here. Background, belonging, language, art, race, where you come from, who you are. Go down a little bit. Identity, family values, norms, attitudes, and beliefs. Got a lot of great answers here.
We sure do.
Differences about people. Yep. See, and so that's why I like WooClap, because you can kind of quickly change the responses as they come in. Do we want to see them as a list? Do we want to see them in a grid? Do we want to make like a little cloud? Apparently of is the most used word in the response, but it's a connector, so I get it. So a lot of great answers. So thank you for participating into that. And what we'll do is I'll screenshot this and I will put this onto our Padlet so that you can see the input from all of you when you go back to look at that. All right. Oh. All right, Kirsten.
There we go. Okay. Let me pull all of my different apps to the right places on these screens, and we'll go ahead and get started. So Geneva Gay quoted Porter and Samovar and their explanation that culture influences what we talk about, how we talk about it, what we see, what we attend to, ignore, how we think, and what we think about. So how each of us identifies is a component of our cultural makeup. Like, have a look at this slide and the identity wheel that's on it. So this is a visual representation of the various factors that build and contribute to any and everybody's sense of cultural identity. Each one of these different categories can be used to illustrate and help us determine different components of our identities and how one person or in how we could identify culturally ourselves. So each one of these different categories also, I should note, have various different shades of how we might define ourselves within there. For example, most of us, I think everybody at the beginning identified themselves as working in the field of education, right? So, however, if we were to think about that and each one of us were to write down, you know, that aspect of our jobs as educators in some capacity, we would define it very differently from person to person, right? Some people would say, oh, I'm a content area teacher, or we had people say Algebra 1 or secondary or high school. Some people may say I work in an urban setting or a suburban setting, or I'm a consultant, although I do think of myself as a teacher along those lines. So it could be a whole variety of different ways with different aspects or variants to each one of these components. And each of these components combine to build and contribute to our overall sense of who we are and how others see us as well. So looking closer at this identity wheel, what I'd like you to do is think about which three components you think about the most, or which that you feel are most prolific or important to your life. This is rhetorical. You do not have to put this into the chat. One thing that we've noticed in thinking about these identity wheels from a personal perspective is that things that some people feel as prolific or important in their life, other people sometimes think about very seldomly. For example, I myself, something that's very important for me is gender. And I think about how my gender can shade or impact the way that I interpret situation. Okay, so due to the extensive different aspects of each one of these categories, we can have unlimited identities, right? Or unlimited numbers of different ways that we can identify. So as educators, when we think about and are aware of our own cultural identity, it helps us kind of think about how to react to or respond to those who may be identified differently. And if we use culture and identity to think about how that can affect our classroom or our practices in our classroom, we can work to become more responsive to a wide variety of cultural identities. So with the variety of cultural identities that may be represented in any given classroom, we need to make sure that we're attending to the various implications of our students' cultural identities when we're thinking about designing our instruction.
And just to jump in, these can change over time, right? So some of the things that you might find important now can change. Like 10 years ago, the things that you would have picked as most important about your own identity might have been different than the 3 things that you might pick now. So just being cognizant that it's kind of fluid in that way, that it can change.
And they can change in how like in your setting from any given
setting
place
as well.
to another place, like how you define or identify yourself at home or amongst your friends may be very different than how you would identify yourself in a professional setting too.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks. Okay. So taking this idea of identity and culture and the definition of that just a step further, we're going to look at and explore culture as it applies to our classrooms and our schools. So culture can affect all situations and it's going to infiltrate kind of all aspects of our lives and our experiences. So it's important to note that all schools have a culture. And so these examples that are on the slide here can influence the culture of a school. For example, seating arrangement, or access to technology, or sometimes lack of access to technology. Staff, the hallways, how the hallway is set up or what it looks like. Languages, and so on and so forth. So Geert Hofstede, I think I said that right. I'm not really up on my Dutch. Was a
well done.
thanks, a Dutch social psychologist who is known for his research on cross-cultural groups, and you can kind of Google him down the road. Later, I'll stick his name in the chat, but he noted and said that societal, national, and gender cultures, which children acquire from their earliest youth onwards, are much deeper rooted in the human mind than occupational cultures acquired at school, or than organizational cultures acquired at the job. That's why these aspects of how we identify feel so personal to a lot of us. Okay. So we're going to go ahead and move into another WooClap.
Now, before you go ahead and put that code in, I do have to go to the WooClap and change the question. So now we should be good.
Thank you. Okay, so this WooClap, you're going to answer this question. What other things in your school or classroom can affect the culture of your school and classroom? So go ahead and enter some other ideas in there that you may have.
And ours were seating, technology, right? Language.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Hallway.
Always
staff.
faculty.
Can you share I know you're doing a lot, but
The responses?
yeah.
Absolutely.
Anybody need the link? Everybody okay still? There we go. Ooh, metal detectors, yeah. Social media exposure. And those kinds of things,
Wow.
whether it's positive or negative, can change, right? Can change a culture of a school. Respect, mascot, parent, school-wide positive behavior, support, administration, phone policies. Yeah. Ooh, they have really good ideas here, Chuck, these folks. They're thinking about it a lot. Yeah, poverty, involvement, discipline systems, peers, all of this. Awesome.
And again, we'll definitely share that on the Padlet.
Yep, thank you. Okay, so have a look at this slide on this, or the map that's on this slide. This map shows an 8-block section of a city or of the city of Tokyo. It is Tokyo, sorry. Imagine that you've just arrived for a vacation and you're trying to get to your hotel and get some rest because you're going to begin your tour tomorrow morning. You're tired, you've been traveling a long time, it's late, you're hungry, all of the above. When you are able to find a passerby who speaks English, you're going to ask them how to find your hotel. You're expecting to hear street names so that you can use them to find your way. But what you didn't know is that in Japan, it's not the streets that are named, but the blocks have numbers. So additionally, this green arrow that across the bottom here, along this street, you notice that the building numbers don't go in an ordered sequence along the road. Like it's starting at 1, 2, goes back to 1, 3, and 2. So as you're walking along, it doesn't seem to make any sense at all. Knowing that the blocks are numbered and not the streets in between, and on each block, the buildings have these numbers, it would help you if I told you that the buildings on each block are numbered in chronological order as to when they were built. So the first block, or the first building built on that block is numbered 1, and the second building built is numbered 2. So you can tell which buildings are the newest on the block because they have the highest number. Does that make sense? Okay. Wow, right? Really different than here in the US, right? So at this point in finding your hotel, you may be feeling kind of defeated or frustrated. You can't use any of your prior understandings to navigate and find your way to the hotel. You're starting to get hangry. You may even be feeling a little bit like a failure. So let's explore this analogy in the context of how this could appear as an indicator of proficiency. You are looking like you're incapable of finding your hotel because you're in a new city. But what we know is that you didn't lose the skills that you brought from the US and your culture here, or what you know from here, but that prior cultural understanding is affecting your ability to be able to demonstrate that you're able to navigate and your skills to get to the hotel at this time. So thinking about the 3 major components of responsive teaching, which we're going to talk about a little bit later: demand, relevance, and agency, we can apply this scenario to those 3. So is the demand present? You're motivated to get to your hotel and rest. This real life example here is certainly an appropriate task, right? Something that absolutely could happen. You're offered a quote unquote reward as such, right? Like more sleep, get something to eat, have some relaxation, unpack, maybe clean up, and no amount of any other reward. Like if I said to you, you could find your hotel, I'll give you, I don't know, $100,000. No amount of that money is going to make it easier for you without getting more information about how the blocks and the building numbers are organized. The second component is relevance. Here's where there's a mismatch, right? Like the block numbering system and the age of the buildings really have no relevance with our prior experiences from the state, right? So additionally, the streets aren't really the tools for navigating. They're just those negative spaces between the blocks, which have the numbers. And then the third component is agency. You know you don't have a poor sense of direction. You're able to navigate for the most part, or find your way around when you're familiar with the culture or the way that things are done here in the US, right? Plug it into the GPS or however that might work. So it's not about having the motivation or seeing yourself as able. So after thinking about this example, I pose that we think about the correlation between this example of cultural discontinuity and the cultural discontinuity that some students that we have may experience when they're coming into our schools and classrooms. So, you know, as rhetoric, would it appear that they have difficulty with achievement on certain tasks, or is this a root cause of not having the same cultural foundations as underpin our lessons or our school or our classroom or our activities or our classroom expectations, all of those things? So does this hold true for the students in our schools if their culture and the school's culture aren't congruent? So we're going to go ahead and explore some ways to illustrate how we can overcome this. So thinking again about this example, there's large populations of those with certain shared cultural aspects who are systematically seeing lesser results, as Chuck shared on a previous slide, and they're seeing lesser results. That's the problem, but it's not the problem. It's a solution or a symptom of this cultural discontinuity. Sorry about that. So the achievement gap that we note or see as a problem, the true root problem is actually the opportunity gap that's linked to culture. So to better understand what this means, we're going to first understand what culture is, the culture of a school, and then what does this mean historically here in the US? Perfect, thank you. Okay, so have a look at this quote on the slide, defining cultural discontinuity. And it comes from Lovelace and Wheeler. And truly, like, cultural discontinuity at its most basic is defined as a lack of cohesion between two or more cultures. So the concept of cultural discontinuity can help us explain why we're seeing this achievement or opportunity gap for our students that's going to stem from the difference between their experiences at home or outside of school in their community and what they're experiencing within school. I'm good.
Yep. So now that we have an idea of what cultural discontinuity means, right? That like, as Kirsten said, that lack of cohesion between the culture that you grew up with that's deeply rooted inside of you and a culture that you may walk into in a situation or at school or wherever that is different, right? That you're not expecting. Let's look at a model. This is a bidirectional model presented by Berry, I believe in 1968. But he originally created this, he called it the model of acculturation, right? And acculturation just being that, like, you have to respond to a culture that you're not used to. Okay, so he presented this model, and there's two, like I said, it's bidirectional. So there's two things that he took into account. Number one, the value and the ability to maintain your native culture, that deeply rooted culture within you, and the value and the ability to maintain the host culture or the new culture that you're entering into. So there are 4 ways to respond in this model. You can see them in the grid. There's marginalization, assimilation, separation, and integration. And on the outside of the grid, you'll see words yes and no. So if someone is not able to preserve or maintain their core culture, okay, that they bring with them, Berry thought that there was only 2 ways to respond to this, right? They either had to fully assimilate into the host culture, right, because they had given up their own, so they had to go to the new culture, or they became marginalized, where they lost their own culture and the host culture marginalized them, sent them to the outskirts, made them lesser. Really bad situation, right? The other 2 responses are if an individual is able to maintain their native culture, they can either integrate or separate. And so integration is when they are able to keep their own core values that they bring with them and still move into the host culture and be accepted in that culture as well. Separation would be that the host culture is not accepting them, or they just choose not to be part of it, and they kind of separate away from that host culture, and they find other people that are similar to them and their native culture, and they just kind of stay in their own little group, right? They choose not to become part of the newer culture. So Berry states that this procedure or this process is reciprocal and mutual. And as long as the larger society targets a particular group, they're unlikely to orient themselves to the larger society by seeking to integrate or assimilate, right? So that would bring us down to that no. Right? If the larger society says, nope, you're not coming in, we're not accepting you, they don't have the assimilation or the integration, they don't have the ability to do that. So instead, they are likely to seek separation or marginalization. In these two strategies, we find the basis for the possibility of radicalization and serious conflict.
Okay, so we're going to do now just a quick chat waterfall. So if you're not familiar with this, you're going to look at this question, think about this idea. Which do you think is most common throughout American history? Which of these 4 aspects of Berry's model? You're going to type your answer into the chat, but do not send it until I say. Okay, so well, then when I say, everybody will send it at the same time and the answers will come into the chat like a waterfall all at once. Okay, so I'm giving everybody a chance to kind of think about what their answer is going to be, get it typed into the chat, and go send them. And we can see coming in, we've got some different ideas. Okay. All right.
Looks like a lot of marginalization, a lot of assimilation. All right.
Some separation, a little bit there too.
Separation
Okay.
too. So we're going to go over a few cases throughout the history, or at least in the beginning parts of history, for America, for the United States, right? And so the first one that I want to look at, the first example, comes from Rand Abramitsky, and he's out of Stanford University, and he just studies culture. That's his thing. He kind of focuses on culture there, like family lines, things like that. And so in 2017, he wrote this article as a research highlight. And what he did is he studied the big immigration migration. So like, when all the immigrants rowed the boats over and started to kind of come over to America. And what he was looking for was, as those immigrants came over, what were they naming their children as generation after generation? And he tracked that. So he would look at a family and he would track the names of their children. And what he found out is that as the years went on, and this is going to sound weird, and I didn't look too much into this, so I don't know what this means, but he gave them a foreignness index, right? And he found out that as the years went on, the names of their children sound less and less foreign, or like the names from their original country that they came from. So as an example, initially they were giving their children names like Hyman or Vito as an example. And after a generation or two, he started to see more names like Clay and Lowell. Okay. And so what he realized was that was a part of their cultural identity that they were giving up voluntarily. They realized that giving their child an American sounding name is a financially cost-free way of identifying with US culture, right? The host culture that they were trying to integrate into. And you can see from the graph, like that foreignness index goes really way down for sons and daughters. And over the course of 30 years, it's really low. And so at that time, having an American sounding name was a badge of assimilation, right? Adopting the host culture at the expense of your original culture. You had to give a piece of it up. But what would happen for your children? Well, children with less foreign sounding names completed more years of schooling, earned more, were less likely to be unemployed. And they also were able to marry someone born with a less foreign sounding name or a more American sounding name. They were more likely to marry somebody else with that kind of a name. So the way I see this is kind of like a voluntary assimilation, right? They were hoping for integration. They wanted to make the opportunities for their children better. And they wanted their children to be able to carry those native traditions, but they had to give some up in order to even allow them to prosper in the new country. So that's just one way. And these were people that were voluntarily coming over, choosing the names, right? So, but that's one way that, we can see Berry's model of response in the history of America.
Okay, so we're going to look at another example of mass migration of people. However, this example was not voluntary. So between the years of 1500 and 1866, Europeans transported to the Americas nearly 12.5 million enslaved Africans who were forced into immigrating to North America as a means of providing free labor. So this is an example of marginalization from Barry's model that comes from history, as these people were not given the opportunities to assimilate or separate, and especially to integrate, because there were certain characteristics that separated them, and those characteristics were not able to be changed. Like in Chuck's example, they could change names to make them more Americanized. What separated this group of enslaved Africans was not able to be changed. So they were segregated, marginalized, dominated, controlled, and it was their external differences, their values, their clothing, their languages, their religious traditions, all of those things, and their way of life before becoming enslaved that were kind of like that were demonized almost. And if we look back through history, we can see some of these examples in the literature. So this cultural example of cultural discontinuity was really forced upon these people, and they were, othered in order to kind of to control them, and so that they could be viewed as property. Their skin color was used to perpetuate broad misconceptions so that they could be dehumanized and seen and treated more as possession, and so that they could remain helpless while their captors basically removed basic human rights so that they didn't feel guilty about doing it. Did you have something to share with that or add to that, Chuck?
No, my light fell. Sorry about that.
Uh-oh.
We're good.
Okay. So there are other examples with other groups of similar things happening at the beginning of the United States, but these other groups that we're going to look at next were given more of a choice. Okay, thanks. Okay, so this is a picture from the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And we're going to kind of look at what happened to the people that have kind of always been here on this continent, or have been here for a longer time than some others of us. And thinking about our Native Americans. So they were given the chance to and expected to assimilate through means of these Indian or industrial schools, or the Indian Industrial School on land that was originally belonged to them. So between the years of 1879 and 1918, there were about 10,000 Native children from over 140 different tribes who attended the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. And I don't know if anybody on this call is from or has been to Carlisle or has seen some of the information there or the buildings that are still remaining. But this white building in this picture is still there. I went to high school in Carlisle and worked at the Army War College, so I'm pretty familiar with the Carlisle Indian Industrial School and its history. So we use the term cultural genocide that has been used to describe the efforts to kind of civilize or remove the quote unquote savage within these Native Americans. So children were taken from their homes, and when they arrived at school, their hair was cut, their clothes were changed. And it was believed that if these students were immersed in Euro-American culture, they could learn to thrive within this dominant culture and maybe even become leaders for their people in the future. An article that was published in 1985 by Cadson and Leggett in the Journal of American Indian Education on the state of Native American education, followed by an article in 1989 by Swisher and Dale, was entitled "The Styles of Learning Are Different, but the Teaching is Just the Same." So from that title, you can see that this notion of cultural discontinuity has been around for a long time.
And we're not going to go over that article, but that is on the Padlet as well. So after putting some thought into this concept of cultural discontinuity and kind of looking at the context, right, and how it's been dealt with in the past, seeing everybody's responses to the survey of how do you think it's really dealt with over the course of American history, what option out of these do you want our students to be able to pursue in your classroom, right? What should be our goal? What do we think? Just throw it in the chat. Out of these options, what should be our goal? Right. And I don't think anybody, after seeing all the different examples that we posted and, saying that, it's a shame, but assimilation and marginalization are probably the go-tos in American history, that we want integration, right? You might be surprised, though, the fewest behavioral and attitudinal changes for an individual is actually found when they separate, which kind of makes sense, right? Because they just keep to remain to their native culture. And the largest is when they assimilate, because they have to completely change. But integration implies like a selective process of maintenance and rejection, right? Because they want to integrate, but they have to kind of maintain both cultures simultaneously, right? And there's also this rejection of like, well, what pieces can I fit where, and how will I be rejected for parts of my native culture fitting in here, or parts of the host culture meshing with my native culture. So overall, integration will impose the least stress on the individual. Assimilation and separation would be associated with moderate levels of stress, and obviously marginalization is the worst, and it's going to cause serious psychological problems. So our goal should be to take that idea of integration, like everybody said, and take it a step further. And I think someone put in there integration, inclusion, similar to that, right? We want to aim to allow individuals to integrate, but also impact the host culture that they're integrating into, so that both cultures merge to create a new, more collaborative culture, right? The problem with that is that it requires a lot of multiculturalism, relatively low levels of ethnic prejudice and discrimination, absence of intergroup hatred, and a sense of identification with the host culture. So a culturally diverse population already there and understands the value of cultural diversity will be more open to cultural diversity, to more cultural diversity. And so our goal, yes, it's integration, but it's really to take that a step further and allow the individuals that are integrating to inform the host culture as well, and to build a better, more inclusive culture all around. So keep that in your mind.
Okay, so what's the purpose of everything that we're talking about today? So once we're able to understand the definition and the historical relevance of cultural dissonance and the gaps that we're facing within education for certain marginalized groups, we need to ask ourselves, why? Like, what's the purpose of education in general? So regardless of any of our own beliefs or beliefs that we've held, in the past, or that our nation has held in the past, this cultural discontinuity that many students can face when they walk into school reframes us as teachers as cultural mediators. Geneva Gay, who's a researcher that we looked a lot to for preparing and finding information for this session today, noted that as cultural mediators, teachers need to engage in responsive practices that are going to use prior experiences, cultural knowledge, different frames of reference, performance styles, et cetera, of ethnically diverse students to ensure that we're making learning encounters more relevant and more effective for them. So defining culturally responsive teaching, we have a definition from Geneva Gay on this slide. And the term culturally responsive teaching comes from Geneva Gay, who used the work of Gloria Ladson-Billings as a springboard to define that. So Ladson-Billings was founded and introduced the term culturally relevant pedagogy, which really focused on pedagogy of oppression towards the collective and empowerment. So she noted that there was a cultural disconnect that framed these opportunity gaps that we've been talking about. Geneva Gay wants to make sure that we're including the cultural characteristics, the experiences, the perspectives of our students, especially those of students who are more vulnerable or disengaged or lower performing, potentially seen as disruptive or labeled at risk, those who are multilingual learners, or those students who are generally less considered when we're thinking about education as a whole, so that we can do a better job of ensuring that we're teaching them more efficiently. Okay, so how does this apply to culturally responsive math instruction or math teaching? So we already alluded to these three main components of culturally responsive teaching, but we also know too that this work is not a silver bullet, and there's no specific curricular resource or program that we can purchase that's going to fill this need. It's more of a like a way of thinking or a mindset for guiding our practices. So we're not going to teach cultural responsiveness. It's not an intervention, etc. We're going to use it as a framework or a consideration, a undergirding idea. And if it's implemented well and considered in lesson planning or thinking about classroom setup, culture as a whole, classroom culture as a whole, the hope is that eventually it's going to help us to avoid any additional interventions or extra pieces that we need to layer on top or add as a Band-Aid to treat that symptom of low achievement. So through the rest of our session today, we're going to explore these three main components, right? The terms that Chuck and I decided to use for this were demand, relevance, and agency. And that was based, like I had said a little bit before, that was based on a lot of different resources that we kind of pulled together. And specifically from Gloria Ladson-Billings' original work. And these ideas were also summarized recently by Zakiya Gates, who is, I think, a professor, right, Chuck?
Yeah, Cabrini University.
Yeah, in an article on math achievement, and he defined them as holding high academic expectations, incorporating students' funds of knowledge, their home and cultural knowledge, their traditions, their language, values in the learning process, and linking purposeful learning to social justice and via the development of critical consciousness. Okay, so Lou Matthews, if anybody's familiar with Lou Matthews' new book, Engaging in Culturally Relevant Math Tasks, also defines these three areas using the same tenets. So demand, relevance, and agency.
All right, so we're going to start with demand. And as Kirsten said, these were just really the arteries that kind of ran through all of the sources that we took into consideration, all the books we read. It kept coming up. They all said it a little bit differently, but it was always demand, relevance, and agency. And so let's just define what demand means. Demand is that the teacher should have high expectations for the student, okay, whether that's through cognitively engaging tasks or high expectations for all students, that the material should be demanding of the student, and that the student should demand and desire the learning, right? So demand in and of itself is kind of multifaceted. And so when we think of demand, we want to think about looking at our students from an asset narrative rather than a deficit narrative. We don't want to lower expectations so that they can meet the bar. That's dangerous. And I think in some of the other sessions that I've facilitated and I've been in, that has come up multiple times, right? But we don't want to take any subgroup of students and lower the bar for them and then make it look like they're achieving, because then they're still not up to par with their peers. So in order to do that, we have to really stop working from a deficit narrative or perspective on what students can't do or what needs to be fixed, right? And we need to start thinking of them in more of an asset narrative. And so that's really like, what do they bring to the table that they're really good at? What are some of the things that, you know, we can leverage to move them forward, to plug those gaps, right? So we still have to meet them where they are, but it's not about, oh, they can't do all of this. This is where they're at. This is what they can do. This is maybe what they bring to the table. And so how can we work from that to build them up? And so this does require data and some forethought. But we have to make sure that we're supporting and challenging students in equitable learning environments. So that includes considering other aspects along with achievement, considering just the student as a whole student rather than just the numbers, right? The students aren't numbers, we're teaching children. And there's actually a video that we ended up taking out from Nate Brown from Penn State University. And he says, you know, something that we often think is like we're math teachers, but we're not teaching, we are teaching math, right? But we're not teaching math, we're teaching children. Okay. We're hoping that they learn math, but we need to start teaching the children in front of us. And so some ways to look at deficit versus asset on this chart here, right? A deficit narrative. And I think like when a teacher gets jaded, they get stuck in a deficit narrative, right? Like they're looking at the students as like, this is why I have so many problems, or these kids can't do this. But it's not about what's broken. It's not about overcoming the weakness in the students or, you know, the deficits. It's not about like building dependent relationships where, you know, the students are dependent on the teacher, right? We want to make sure that we're pushing them to more independence. It's not about highlighting past failures, and instead it's focusing on what does work for our students, specifically, whether it's individually as it's group, emphasizing the strengths and the possibilities, allowing them to see success, help them become internally driven. These aren't easy things that are done overnight, right? It takes time, and that's why this work is more of a mindset. But there are little things that you can do, like highlighting past successes, right? So anything you can do to kind of turn that, whether you want to think about it as like a growth mindset or an asset narrative or whatever it is, to try and help that student kind of see themselves in the math a little bit more, right? To as the quote on the left-hand side says, you know, have unequivocal faith in the human dignity and intellectual capabilities of our students. Not say, well, they're always sent to me from middle school and they don't know any of this stuff, but rather what can we build off of and what are they bringing that is good already? And so some ways to do this is to think about that zone of proximal development. So Vygotsky, right, he created this zone of proximal development. I think it was in like 1978. And that's all about leveraging the point where the student can complete work on their own versus the skills that they would need a little bit of assistance or scaffolding with. And then trying to promote them from the scaffolding to being able to do that skill on their own, and then moving up a predetermined hierarchy of skills to start on the next one, right? And continually moving them little by little to fill in those gaps. But we have to really be careful when we're doing this as well, because we don't want to over scaffold. I think like at least I know I did this all the time. A pitfall is when you over scaffold. And I think, you know, some researchers and some authors call this like learned helplessness, where you over scaffold for a student and they just expect the scaffold all the time. They never learn how to do it on their own. And so, you know, I've heard it called learned helplessness, and I'm sure it's called other things, but we have to be careful not to over scaffold. And so this again this is challenging. You have to take into account where students are, you know, whether you group them, you're working with them individually, the intervention in class, but we have to know what the students bring to the table so that we can tailor our instruction to best fit their needs. And so Johnson and Lang in 1992, I have this quote here. It says, they said, increasing the challenge level of the work is appropriate when performance is at mastery and so long as children have mastered the fundamentals. Generative performances may emerge without additional instruction. So if we do this well, it could propel them forward without a lot more scaffolding, right? They kind of like get those generative performances. And I think Dr. Kirshner was talking about some of that generative stuff earlier today. Okay, so how do we do this? How do we cultivate demand in our classrooms in math? Number one, we should be utilizing data-based decision-making, right? Getting that data, figuring out where students are, and making the decisions based on that in order to make sure that the students are getting what they need. Okay, we want to make sure we're engaging prior knowledge and we're forcing retrieval of previous skills and facts. We don't want to go ahead and teach new material until we know that students are at least fluent in what we already have given them. I know this is tough with time constraints, but we want to ensure that students are making connections and do not see the learning as like disjointed, right? That it flows. Manipulatives are really great. CRA is really great. Those kind of things that build out the conceptual understanding so that students can kind of see the beauty behind the procedures rather than just saying, you know, add these, bring this up here. That creates a disconnect for students. And it just becomes a set of procedures and then they don't really understand what's going on. Games, right, at the appropriate time can be fun when you want to practice a skill. Technology can be beneficial as long as it's used strategically and it doesn't replace explicit instruction. And I like to consider these ways to increase demand for and by students within the instructional hierarchy. So thinking about like, where do they fit, right? We're not going to use some of these when we're talking about students need to acquire the fundamentals. I'm not going to throw them into a game. I'm not going to just throw them on technology when they really need those fundamentals and they need to learn them, right? I'm going to use CRA. I'm going to use modeling. I'm going to use manipulatives. I'm going to kind of scaffold a lot more then. And then as they become fluent and they start to master those concepts, I'm going to pull away my scaffolding and I am going to implement some of the things that might make it a little bit funner or interesting for them. Other ways that aren't on here, you could pre-teach vocabulary, right? Language modeling. Kirsten, do you want to talk about the PLUS framework at all?
Yeah, I can do that. So the PLUS framework is something that has come out of some work that was done to support multilingual learners. And PLUS is an acronym that stands for pre-teaching, critical vocab, and background knowledge. L is language modeling and providing those opportunities to practice. U is using visuals, graphic organizers. The first S is for systematic and explicit instruction, which I'm sure you've heard a lot about in whichever sessions you attended earlier. And then strategic use, the final S is for strategic use of native language, and then thinking about how to transfer knowledge or those assets from the language that that our students are loved in at home to the language that's utilized at school, if that's different. And you have, I think, on the Padlet, there's a link to the PLUS framework if you're interested in using that kind of as an overlay in supporting lesson planning too, or thinking about lesson planning.
Great. So the next one is relevance, and I realize we're kind of running out of time, so I'm trying to move through quickly here. So relevance is ensuring that you as the teacher and the content remain important to students. Okay, one way that you can do this is by developing your pedagogical content knowledge. So this usually comes with time as a teacher, but the more time you put in as a teacher, maybe teaching the same topics or the same curriculum, you know, or this, you know, if you're second grade for a long period of time, or you teach algebra a lot or algebra 2, you know, you develop this pedagogical content knowledge because you've done it for a while. And so you start to learn what examples really work with students or how to phrase something better than it might say it in the textbook. And those kind of things allow you to free up your own working memory and your own time to now not be so marred down by like interpreting what needs to be interpreted and learning the content yourself, but it allows you to open up opportunities to make the content more relevant for your students. So utilizing pedagogical content knowledge to tailor lessons and learning is critical to ensure success for all learners. However, work on pedagogical content knowledge with only few exceptions lacks explicit attention to the relationships among power, race, culture, and language in the classroom. So it's not that we only want to make everything relevant. We want to make sure that we're covering everything too, but without developing that pedagogical content knowledge, you can't even strive to make the content relevant. And so we know that responsiveness comes from relevance. For instance, right, responsiveness is that action after you have determined what is relevant to somebody else. I can't be responsive to you if I don't know what you consider to be relevant. So it's about learning what our students think is relevant and then responding to that. Being relevant as a teacher for students is to showcase awareness and intentionality in all aspects of your teaching. And that's basically what we have on the left column there, right? Being humble, giving quality feedback, identifying biases, your own, being interpersonal, using emotion and humor, considering student input, consistent effort to improve and reflect your own instruction, and then understanding the systematic barriers that students are up against. Cornel West, who is a philosopher around this kind of work, said, you know, we don't start with young children, we start with what young children are up against. So having knowledge of that and understanding those systematic barriers can be very helpful in seeing the world and school through the eyes of your students. And then on the right side, right, we have how to make the content or structure relevant to students. So the key to making that relevant is understanding where your students are, using the instructional hierarchy like we talked about, right, determining when things are appropriate to be implemented. Being responsive in this way allows you to vary your instructional methods while preserving the efficiency of the task. And so like using different formats when you teach, not always doing the same thing, right? Like direct instruction practice, homework, direct instruction, right? But varying it, using collaboration, cultivating wonder and curiosity, or allowing kids to explore. But again, for exploring and discovery activities, we probably should only implement those after students have acquired and have become fluent with a skill. Otherwise, we might be, you know, sending mixed signals. Brent, I like this second to last one, embracing the sense-making routine that students bring. So often we say, this is how you have to do it. Here's another way, you know, use the one you like, or make sure that you understand how to do both. But sometimes students come with different ways that they kind of made sense of things, and allowing them to voice that and then taking that in, right, and utilizing that as part of the instruction could be very helpful. Here are some examples. These all come from the culturally responsive math guide that we have on the Padlet. I just want to highlight one of them, and that's this first one, adding and subtracting fractions. I know as I taught high school, middle school, when I was an elementary coach, all in different districts, but when I saw an adding or subtracting fractions lesson when I taught, the book usually had some type of activity where it used the recipe or something, like how many cups of this or that, and they were in fractions, right? And students were either asked to add and subtract different parts, or scale up the fractional components in order to create the recipe for a larger group of students. And one quick and easy way that I was like, wow, I wish I would have thought of that, to make that a little bit more culturally responsive, is to ask the students to bring in the recipe of their favorite food, or a recipe that maybe, you know, they get at home or comes from their community. If they can't bring something in, have them Google a recipe for their favorite food, or go to the site of a local eatery in the community and pull a recipe and pull a dish and find the recipe for that, right? And it doesn't really change the task of having to scale fractions or add and subtract fractions, but it brings in a piece of who they are and where they come from. And, you know, everybody gets to participate in that as well. So it's not like we're just singling out one culture or anything like that, but we're allowing all of the students to bring. There's many other examples, even just like collecting your own data, setting up competition for students. Those kind of things really make it relevant for the students in your classroom. And so now I'm going to defer to Kirsten for agency.
And so the third component we're going to look at is this component of agency. And I think that agency kind of flows really nicely from this idea of relevancy, and sometimes has a little bit of an overlap here. But agency really starts to look at, venture into this idea of education for social justice. And that's only a component of this concept of agency, but there's additional components or different pieces as well. So it's also students taking responsibility for their own learning, understanding, studying the world around them, and persevering in a challenge that they have kind of undertaken or noticed within their community or society that affects them. So it's getting involved in the struggle. And in order to kind of help students start to think about having agency in math thinking, we need to start small. Okay, so thinking about this concept or this idea of agency in micro, mid, and macro kind of lenses. So at the micro level, we might be thinking about allowing students to be part of classroom development and thinking about what are our agreements for class, and allowing them to kind of have a voice is helping to provide them with agency. We want to ignite their curiosity, their desire for learning. And we want them to also be able to see why math is important to them and to society as a whole, is also a component of supporting agency. So once these kinds of small steps have kind of been explored, you're going to build upon those throughout the remainder of the year to incorporate more of your students' voice, more of their worlds, so that they can see where mathematical thinking kind of applies to their lives. And once they're able to kind of think about math in a bigger way, they're going to start to see aspects of social justice potentially in those areas in which they're interested. Those things that will apply to challenges or things that they see in their everyday lives. Great, thank you. So thinking about this concept of agency, you may have heard of this kind of referred to as windows or mirrors, windows, and sliding doors, that comes from work by Bishop. And it helps, and to explain this a little bit deeper, like our student, it can be defined or clarified by thinking about our students' desire in their learning to be able to see themselves as mathematicians or someone who can be successful. Oftentimes students see math as something that's apart from them. I mean, I think about like all of these memes or things that I say that are like, hey, algebra, thanks so much, solve your own problems, or things like that, which are relatively funny, but also show us just how much of society thinks that math is not something that they're doing on a regular basis. And when we think about it, mathematics is occurring around the globe. People of all nations, backgrounds, identities, etc., are engaging in mathematical thinking daily. And we want our students to be able to see themselves not as a spectator, but as a participant. Okay, so this slide talks about building connections and utilizing community as a way to grow your mindset and your practices around culturally responsive teaching, but also to utilize the community in which your school or your classroom or your students come from as a resource. So this information from Ferguson in 2008 talks a little bit more about ways that we can utilize school family connections and the culture from which our students come to support building agency.
And this would be more of like that mid-level, right? Like
Yes,
you can do things as a teacher, but this is a lot of stuff that schools need to do as well to foster that that relationship
outside of just your activities in your classroom. And then this next slide has 3 questions that can help you when you're thinking about lesson planning to think about whether you're addressing agency within your lesson planning. And finally, like these are some more activities that come from that culturally responsive math guide that's on the Padlet, but thinking about ways that students may find agency or see where math is utilized within their day-to-day. So when Chuck and I were preparing for this, we were thinking potentially about like, you can kind of see there's an article or a lesson on here about food deserts. So areas where there may not be healthy food available in certain communities or areas. We were thinking too, I was thinking a lot last week about the air quality index, which I never knew what that was until last week when I started kind of looking as the smoke from the wildfires was hanging over, I live in the Lehigh Valley, so over the Lehigh Valley, and causing issues with breathing and et cetera for folks. So thinking about that, thinking about rainfall or other aspects of justice, and there are some links on the Padlet that you can explore as to exploring how race and income data on a geographic map may overlap, or thinking about whether college is worth the money, whether it's worth the cost, right? The pros and cons of going to college or going to a technical school or becoming a tradesperson. So all of those aspects could be part of agency.
All right, we're pretty much out of time, so I'm going to try and fly through this, but we already have gone over a lot of this, right? We know that the structure and decisions that are made by the adults in the school influence the components that are in our classrooms. We know that the culture, the background that we bring, the community, the beliefs that we hold, right, lead us into those structures and decisions. We were going to do a woo clap, we're going to have to skip, but really it was, which do you think is more prevalent in today's classrooms, right, across the nation? The teacher contributes more or the student contributes more to those components of the classroom? And not only that, but let's flip it on its head. Who has to regulate their culture due to the decisions that were made? Is the teacher, you, regulating the culture that you're bringing and allowing the students to participate more in order to make those decisions and influence the components? Or are the students the ones who have to regulate that? And so that kind of brings us back to that Berry model and Kirsten's Tokyo example, right? Like, who is doing the regulating? Keep that in your mind when you think of this stuff. And as we leave you in the next minute or so here, when you start this work or when you think about how you can become more culturally responsive, right? Think big, but as you implement, think small, right? That's from James Clear, who wrote Atomic Habits. And so like, maybe you start by giving your students more of a voice, or maybe you can learn more about them and weave those experiences into your problems and your conversation. Maybe you can consider how classroom expectations might cause your students to regulate what they bring, to secure your comfort or other comfort. Or maybe you think of ways to show all your students that they can attain success regardless of their previous experiences in education, right? Maybe you just seek out and study publications and research surrounding this topic, or maybe you start with the ones located on the Padlet. Regardless of what you choose, use small steps to make big change. And I'm going to leave you with one last quote, and then I'm going to give you your code really quickly. And this is from Zaretta Hammond, who does some work in this field as well. And she says, it's important to point out that culturally responsive teaching is about your stance as an educator. It takes time to master, but teachers can put core practices into place now. You don't have to begin this journey alone. Do it in a community with other teachers.